Good. All right. Well, welcome everyone to another week, Sunday school. We're going to kind of continue, like last week we talked about getting your feet wet. So we're going to kind of start continuing that, but we're going to jump ahead to David and Goliath. And this is a really pretty amazing book. That's one chapter we're going to review, but there's so much in this chapter that's so packed, and we're really going to go at the Eastern learning for this thing. So the way in the West we typically learn, here's the point, here's my evidence, and we do it. In the East, it's a story. And within that story, they're going to hint to or write at certain events that's going to take you to somewhere back in the Bible. So as we read, we're going to break it up in little sections. I really want y'all to think about the words they use and what does that bring to you? What's the deeper meaning? Where does it go? So we'll do a quick review from where we were. Genesis 1, God created the world, and it was very good. It was perfect, couldn't make it any better, it was awesome. And then in Genesis 2, he encourages us to rest and enjoy the very goodness. Basically, the premise of this was trust the story. Trust me. I gave you everything you need. I will provide for you. Just trust me. He'll give, but here's the thing, he'll give you what you need and not want. So that's how I think today we get into, well, I want this. You might think you want it, but you don't really need it. So God gives us what we need, and ultimately we're not here for ourselves. We're here for a purpose. He put us here for a purpose in the church family with talents and abilities to do what he wants. And he's going to push you to what you need to be so you can fulfill that. Of course, we failed. We didn't trust it, the story. And it got so bad, he wiped the world clean and started over. When Noah, he destroyed the world. And then next chapter, Genesis 11, we're back at it again at the Tower of Babel. Right? We're not trusting the story. God wanted us to be mobile and trust him, but they decided, no, we're going to build this Mecca temple that's going to keep the whole world here. And they did it for themselves. Genesis 12, so God said, you know what? I promised I wouldn't wipe the world out again, so I'm going to start a family. He taps Abraham, and he gives the Abrahamic covenant, and these are his chosen people to bring light to the world. He promised to put them in a land not their own, and we talked about last week, this land is the crossroads, at this time, it's the crossroads of the world. Everything between Africa and Asia, you have to go through either Via Maris or the King's Highway. So that's what's God's point. I'm going to put my kingdom in the kind of middle of it, the world. So as people pass through, they're going to see his family, they're going to see my country, see this greatness, and they're going to want to follow him. So this would have been the betrothal period. We talked about wedding, how it went Eastern. So this was the betrothal pyramid. God comes, says, Abraham, I'm going to give you this. Abraham accepted, so he leaves essentially and will go build a home for his people. And then we come to Exodus. God returns for his bride, as would be the tradition, and he brings them out of Egypt, takes them to Mount Sinai, and he marries them. And they become a covenant. And when we went through the Eastern wedding, he went through all the steps, and the ultimate goal was be a kingdom of priests. That was what the ultimate goal is. And then Peter adds to this, be a people of royal priesthood. And how do you become a priest? Well, the tabernacle was set up right in the middle of the camp. You go there twice a day to pray. And so you see what priests are doing. He gave us Leviticus. And the goal was everyone learn that and become priestly. So we get this struggle that Bema podcast, I don't know who came up with it, but he does. It's empire versus shalom. And empire would have been Egypt. And it's about, you're only worth what you produce. If you don't produce enough bricks, I'm going to get rid of you and put someone who can. I'm going to cast you out, and so your family, so everything is dependent on you producing. It's about selfishness, preservation. You live in fear. He rules with us. He rules with, fear. In Shalom, God's kingdom, he leads with voice. There's trust. It's selflessness. God's going to take care of you. He encourages us on the Sabbath, like rest. Take a day off. Don't worry about anything. I will provide for you. So then they leave to go to the promised land, but when they get there, his bride is not ready. They don't trust the story. They get a report, and everyone's scared. So he was like, okay. So they embark on this 40-year journey inside the desert or the wilderness of Israel. Then they come back to the promised land. It's kind of what we picked up last week. Now they get their feet wet. But after they crossed, they somewhat conquered the land, but they fell short. Right? Not everyone took the land they were supposed to. For instance, Dan was supposed to defeat the Philistines. They didn't do it. They were afraid, so they settled up north. They got caught up in empire. Instead of trying to be, God said, go conquer the land, I have you, they kind of got caught up in self-preservation. The Philistines at the time were one of the most advanced cultures in the world. They had iron, they had all this wealth because they owned that coastal plain, this little crossroads. So, you want what they have, so you kind of get caught up in their culture. And that's where you get to the Judges, right? It's the redemptive cycle. If you go through Judges, it's this country conquered us, then God sent a judge, he saved us for 40 years, and this constant cycle of, getting conquered, fighting back. And for the Philistine, Samson, he was the one. He was a Nazarite. He was the one that was supposed to end the Philistines. But of course, he liked women. He drank. He failed ultimately. He didn't finish what God wanted. And that was the whole thing about this. God hears their cries, and he brings someone to save them. Try to bring them back to this empire to trust. And so we come over to Samuel, right? So the people finally say, we'll read 1 Samuel 8, 1-9. What do the people say? Okay. So, when Samuel became old, he made his son judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn son was Joel, and the name of his second, Moses? Abijah. Okay. They were judges in Beersheba, yet his sons did not walk in his way, but turned aside after gain. They took bribes and perverted justice. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Raham and said to him, Behold, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your way. Now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations. But this thing displeased Samuel when he said, Give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, Obey the voice of the people and all that they say to you. For they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them, according to all the deeds that they shall have done from the day I brought them out of Egypt, even to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are also doing to you. So, there's the people. They're kind of sick of the judge thing, right? It's not working. We're not being conquered. Everyone has a king. They want a king. And what's the point of the king? Someone to lead them, to fight their battles, to do all that. So, and originally when God set this up in Judges, God was king, and he would take care of you, and the judges would have been a judge. And it's not a judge in a robe, right? We beat that image in America. Really, a judge is someone who, yes, he does judge, but he also follows through with the redemption. It's not, I'm going to sentence you. He goes through and makes sure the redemption and it's done, restoration. So then it goes on, 10:18. Samuel's warning against the kings. So Samuel told all the word of the Lord to the people who were asking for a king for him. He said, These will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots, and to be his horsemen, and to run before his chariots. And he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and some to plow his grounds, and to reap his harvest, and to make his implements of war, and the equipment of his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to the servants. He will take the tenth of the grain and of the vineyards and give it to his officers and to his servants. He will take your male servants, female servants, and the best of your young men and your donkeys and put them to work. He will take the tenth of your flock, and you shall be his slaves. And in that day you will cry out because of your king, who you have chosen for yourself, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. So, and of course, they still go on, right? We want a king, blood be on our hands. So God's warning them, like, this is what's going to happen. And when we keep reading through as we get into Kings and Chronicles, we're going to see that. And so they pick a king, right? Or God chooses a king. 1 Samuel 10, 23 to 24. Then they ran and took him from there. And as he stood among the people, he was taller than any of the people, from his shoulders upward. And Samuel said to all the people, "Do you see him who the Lord has chosen? There is none like him among all the people." And all the people shouted, "Long live the king." So they appointed Saul. He looks like a king. He's handsome, he's tall, he's a big guy. And even Samuel's saying, look, there's none like this guy in all of Israel. And everyone's like, long live the king. So they're happy at this point. For a time. So now we're going to move over to 17, the David and Goliath story. So this is where we are. Saul is king. He did some good things in the beginning, but he loses favor with God. And so this is where the battle's going to take place. Right here, this dot, what we're talking about. And so you can see kind of, this is Ekron, Gath. This is all the Philistine territory. They own this coastal plain. And you have the coastal plain and the mountains, and this is a valley in between. And this was the main road everyone went to. So this was a very fought after piece of land because you own this middle strip. You own the trade, and basically you control world trade. And so this was the fight scene, right? When we get to the story, you had Israelites on one side, King David, the valley of Elah, that's where they fought. And then the Philistine, this is the coastal plain right here. So the Philistine camp would have been here. And everyone's going to march down and they're going to fight in this middle right here. So this is today's map. You can see it's a farm field. But this would have been that place where this battle is going to take place. So this is the Israelite camp. So when David comes down to fight Goliath, he walks down this path. There's the stream, right? Stream's kind of important. He picks up some stones. So David's going to walk down, go to the stream, pick up the rocks, go walk out across this plain and fight Goliath. This is just kind of give you all the imagery. So 1 Samuel 17, 1 to 11. So someone want to read 1 Samuel 17, 1 to 11?
Yeah, I got it. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Succoth, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Succoth and Azekah in Ephes-Dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in line of battle against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armor on his legs, and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron. And his shield bearer went before him. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistines said, "I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man, that we may fight together." When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid.
All right, so here is Goliath coming out, taunting them. bronze helmet, bronze scale. Pretty scary guy. So what do we see in these verses? What are y'all imagery?
Well, first of all, I would like to comment on the fact that Bible translators are like, we will translate everything but the math. Yeah. You're going to do that on your own.
I got that. I got the math. Don't worry. I got that. I went through and found the math. So.
But I'm assuming that this is like literally heavy stuff. Like it is,
oh, yeah.
I think, the imagery you're supposed to get is that this is very overwhelming.
It's the son of the shekel.
A shekel, whatever that is. I'm like, translate it. Come on.
Well, Hebrew translates, but white don't.
Isn't a shekel a pound? Like, not a pound.
So this is what it would be. So
2/5 of an ounce or 11 grams.
Yeah.
So Goliath would have been 6 cubits tall, the best, and this would have been the best armor in the world, right? They were iron. History, the most powerful kingdoms have always been war technology, right? They own the world. At this time, iron, this is the Iron Age, and so they were very good on iron. They knew how to create iron, so that's why the Philistines were so powerful. His spearhead weighed 15 pounds. I don't know if you've ever thrown a spear, but a 15-pound weight, if that hits you, that is just going to devastate you. Armor weighed 125 pounds. And there is a mistranslation, like you mentioned translation, but more accurately, it said the breastplate of metal, it's a breastplate of scales. And so one thing, too, that I kind of learned, that I've started learning in the Bible, Chronicles, so important. We glass over Chronicles. Because a lot of people don't understand it. It's that you read Chronicles and you sound like, well, this kind of sounds like it's contradicting what is written here. And the way they explain it, which it makes sense to me, is this is today as the war's happening today. If you go to Vietnam, right, in the Vietnam War, and you're reading the news headlines, the news reports, from Judges to 2 Kings and Ezra and Nehemiah, you're getting the news of the day. So it would be how we see it, what our topics were. Chronicles was written in the Babylonian exile. So a couple of 100 years afterwards, with hindsight, they were writing down Chronicles. So reading Chronicles is like watching a documentary today on the Vietnam War, right? We didn't quite get the headlines, but they have all these years of hindsight. And Chronicles tends to pick up the overall story God wants to tell. So you're getting kind of your details here, and Chronicles is following up with some more, what is the point of this story? So that's why Chronicles is very important. So I encourage you, if you're reading a story in the Bible, go to Chronicles and find it in Chronicles and read what it says in Chronicles. What's nice about Chronicles, it's not long. It's real brief. It'll say, like when you get to David and his men, you'll get this story in Chronicles. It's just a little paragraph, but it gives a little more insight. So let's go read Chronicles 20:4-8. First Chronicles 20:4-8.
You just want somebody to read it?
Yeah, if you someone just read.
And after this there arose war with the Philistines of Gazer. Then Sibbecai the Hushathite struck down Sippai, who was one of the descendants of the giants, and the Philistines were subdued. And there was again war with the Philistines, and Elhanan the son of Jair struck down Lahmi, the brother of Goliath the Gittite, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. And there was again war at Gath, where there was a man of great stature, who had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in number, and he was a descendant from the giants. And when he taunted Israel, Jonathan, the son of Shemiah, David's brother, struck him down. These were the descendants from the giants in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants.
Okay. So, kind of get a little more insight about the genealogy of Gath. So, what is it trying to set up here? Is there anything kind of numbers, right? Numbers mean a lot to Hebrew. Whenever you read numbers, so here's a guy, 6 cubits tall, with 6 fingers and 6 toes, wearing a breastplate of scales. Does that kind of ring a bell or something in this story? I don't know, somewhere we read about a scaly person. 666, numbers mean something, right? So really what this part of this thing is telling us, this is not just a battle for land. This is God setting something up against Satan, coming and taunting the fear of the world, right? Society, we're afraid. And he's taunting this. And God wants us to trust the story. And everyone's afraid. No one wants to get their feet wet. No one is doing this. 3,000 men, Israel army, and not one man will come up. So this is what this is really mean. This is not a battle. So when they're reading this as a Hebrew and you're reading the 666, they're going, oh, this is the devil. This is evil. It's going much deeper than just a battle like we read about. So let's read, someone read 1 Samuel 17, 12 to 20. Okay. Now David was the son of an Ephraimite of Bethlehem in Judah named Jesse, who had 8 sons. In the day of Saul, the man was already old and advanced in years. The 3 oldest sons of Jesse had followed Saul to the battle, and the name of his 3 sons who went into battle were Eliab, the firstborn, the next to him, Abinadab, and the third, Shammah. David was the youngest of the 3 eldest, followed by the 3 eldest who followed Saul. But David went back and forth from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. For 40 days the Philistines came forward and took his stand morning and evening. So, where do we get... Oh, I'm sorry, to 20. Sorry.
Jesse said to David his son, take for your brothers an ephah of this parched grain and these 10 loaves, and carry them to the camp to your brothers. Also take these 10 cheeses to the commander of your 1,000. See if your brothers are well, and bring them some token from them. Now Saul and they, all the men of Israel, were in the valley of Elah, fighting with the Philistines. And David rose early in the morning and left the sheep for the keeper, and took the provisions, and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the encampment as the host was going out to the battle line, shouting a war cry.
All right. So, anything we see on this that kind of brings back memory, something previous, maybe a figure in Genesis. Joseph. Who was he?
The youngest.
The youngest son. David was the youngest son. What did he go do? Check on his brothers, right? What did Joseph go do? Check on his brothers. Whoops. Whoops. Okay, cool. All right. So, that's what he did. So, what was Joseph? What did Joseph do? In the story, what does Joseph end up doing?
Saving his brothers.
Saving his brothers. Saving the whole family of Israelite, right? He rose up to be number 2. He saved his family. So when you're reading this and you're saying this youngest, they're drawing a comparison to Joseph. So as you see this young kid, David, that's what they're kind of referring to. Here's this Joseph-like person. If you know the story of Joseph, it's kind of foreshadowing on what David's going to do or what he's going to become. Because he was number 2. He was the captain of Saul's guard, and then he eventually becomes king. So the oldest 3 followed Saul to battle. So you had Eliab, who is the oldest, and as the oldest, remember, they get the double portion. He is the next in line. He is supposed to be, of all your brothers and sisters, the leader, right? So Jesse, David's father, is the patriarch. They live in a patriarchal society, so something happened. Eliab is supposed to be the next one in charge. But what is Eliab? Is he going out there fighting Goliath? No, he's just as scared, right? He's like everyone else. There's nothing kind of special about this kid, and he's supposed to be the leader. So that's important, right? Because this guy's supposed to be the one leading it. And we get this little reference. For 40 days, Goliath taunted them. It's just kind of right there in the middle, and you kind of gloss right over it. And we said numbers mean something. So what is 40? What does 40 mean to the Hebrew people?
Time of testing.
Time of testing. So really here you have Satan setting up, taunting them for 40 days, testing Israel, and nobody steps up. No one, for 40 days, he's testing them every day. Twice a day, Goliath is coming out, taunting Israel, and no one steps up. So, again, we're failing. We're not trusting the story. All right, talked about that. So like I said, 40 days, no one got their feet wet. No one was able to go down, cross that little stream, and go stand up to Goliath. So let's read 21 to 25.
And Israel and the Philistines drew up for battle, army against army. And David left the things in charge of the keeper of the baggage and ran to the ranks and went and greeted his brothers. As he talked with them, behold, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came up out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before. And David heard him. All the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were much afraid. And the men of Israel said, Have you seen this man who comes up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. And the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches and will give him his daughter and make his father's house free in Israel.
All right, pretty good deal, right? That's a pretty good deal. So David just comes up on the scene, and it just happens on day 40. Here's David showing up, and Goliath is defying him, right? So anything significant about this little passage? So they were very much afraid, right? They weren't just afraid. You say they were very much afraid. So who should be fighting this battle? Realistically, if you're a Hebrew, who should be the one fighting this battle?
The warriors.
No. Saul, right?
Oh, Saul, yeah.
Because they bet a king, there was no one like him in the land. He's a foot taller than anyone, and that's the whole point of a king. Right, the king was supposed to fight the battle. So really, beyond just Israel being afraid, this is showing everyone Saul, who we wanted, there was no one like him, is a coward. He's in the tent, hiding, essentially, and he should be the one to go down and go toe-to-toe with Goliath. But Saul's afraid. Your leader's afraid. Everyone's afraid. So that's important. So let's read 1 Samuel. Someone read 1, 8 to 9. Yeah. And then 9, 1 to 2. Sticky paper. Oh, did we?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. 9, 1 to 2. Okay, there was a man from Benjamin whose name was Kish, the son of Abiel, son of Zerah, son of Becherah, son of Alphera, a Benjamite, a man of wealth. And he had a son whose name was Saul, a handsome young man, and there was not a man among the people of Israel more handsome than he. From his shoulders upward, he was very tall than any other people. So, again, here's Samuel. There was no one like him, handsome, perfect, But also he was a Benjaminite. Kind of go back. Where is David from? What tribe is David from? Judah, right? He's a Benjaminite, Judah. That has some significance here, right? What did Judah do? And going back to the story of Joseph. What did Joseph do with Benjamin? Remember?
Didn't he take him back?
He held him for ransom, right? Because that was his true brother. And he was afraid the other brothers would kill him. So to protect him, he said, remember he put the thing in his thing and said, oh no, he tried to betray him. Judah, and Jesse wouldn't let anyone go back for food. And Judah, remember all know the story of Judah, right? Had 2 sons that died, were selfish, prostitution. He wasn't a good guy. Wanted to get Joseph killed originally. But out of all the brothers, Judah comes down, and Reuben tries to do it. He said, I will give you my sons as a sacrifice. And Judah says, no, I will give you my life. He basically, the selflessness, say, I will do, he ultimately gives his own self to save Benjamin. Say, trust me, let me go save my brother. Let me save my family. So Judah, and all the people, all the brothers, kind of has a turn. That, to me, why I think Judah is the chosen one, because all the other brothers were kind of crappy.
I think Judah was also the one, like, when Joseph confronts his brothers, Judah was the one that said, like, we had a brother and we sold him into slavery, and that was like a big mistake. Like, he showed repentance to Joseph before Joseph revealed himself.
Yes, and so I say Judah was this one turning. And everyone gives him a hard time because he has his own little, but it's significant, why just give a story about Judah? In the Bible, again, if you're reading it, here's Joseph, then kind of takes a pause, it talks about Judah, and then if you read the next chapter, it seamlessly picks up for that one. So anytime there's something inserted, like the 40 days, it's significant. So as we read this, when you see something that seems out of place, there's a reason. And it goes through his genealogy, right? And I think this is going to have when we get a little further on, his genealogy is going to have something to do with it. So he was from Judah. So you have Judah and Benjamin. Here is a Benjaminite Saul facing down this Philistine army, and they're scared. Pretty sure just like Benjamin was being captured in Egypt. It's like the same story. And so God's sending David, a man after his own heart, from Judah, and, to save the day, essentially. So let's go on to 1 Samuel 17, 26 to 30.
And David said to the men who stood by him, what shall be done to the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the people answered him in the same way, so shall it be done to the man who kills him. Now Eliab, his eldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men. And Eliab's anger was kindled against David, and he said, why have you come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. And David said, what have I done now? Was it not but a word? And he turned away from him toward another and spoke in the same way, and the people answered him again as before.
Okay. What kind of happens here? What do we see here? So David shows up, he's having a regular conversation, and then his brother gets mad at him. What do we see here? Is there anything deeper? Like, what is David really saying?
You're all a bunch of cowards.
Exactly. He's basically
Y'all
calling them.
following the Lord.
Exactly. So here you got David, and there's a key word in there, right? Uncircumcised Philistine. So what is circumcision?
The son.
It's the promise, right? It is how you do the covenant. Abraham and God's covenant is circumcision. So here's David saying, hey, this is an uncircumcised Philistine. Like, we are the chosen people. We have his blessing. We have his covenant. This guy doesn't. And so you can imagine if you're a bunch of guys and here's this 12, 13-year-old boy making that comment, you're feeling, oh, man. And what does Eliab do? His brother. And he says, who defies the army of the living God? Not only is he just uncircumcised, but he is calling out and, making fun of God. What's the third commandment?
Don't take the Lord's name in vain.
Don't take the Lord's name in vain, right? So this is a big one. So Eliab, anger gets kindled because basically his little brother called him out, right? I'm the older brother. And so that's, like Russ said it, that's why he calls out. And like an older brother, you're supposed to correct your little brother. Like, hey, shut up. That's what big brothers do. He's the youngest and like, hey, get out of here.
But I'd have to think, you would have to feel super guilty if you're standing around and David comes in and says these things. Like, all of a sudden, it's going to strike to your heart, and then your anger is kindled because you're like, oh my gosh, my little brother's right, and I can't let anybody know he's right. I mean, there's so much going on there.
Ego.
And he changes the subject. Who'd you leave the sheep with? Who's watching the sheep? I know you. You just came to watch the battle. He kind of deflects.
So irresponsible.
He deflects to the responsibility. Aren't you supposed to be doing
Just
the
like you
sheep,
do.
whatever?
Passive-aggressive.
So how does that? I mean, that's not sitting today. It's like let's deflect to something else.
You just went to the bathroom.
Not relatable at all.
Yeah. So in a group of 3,000 soldiers, this kid is the only one not afraid. And this was so unique, it caught the attention of the king. So Saul hears about this, like, who is this boy? Bring him to me. Basically this little kid just called out the whole army, making, like I said, everyone's feeling guilty, bad. It's like, oh yeah, we should fight. And it was so unique in the camp that Saul wants to talk to him. So, again, talked about last week, getting those feet wet. So let's go, 17:31 to 37. This is where you see David, of all the people in the Bible, has the biggest, bravest, right here. So, someone read 31 to 37.
When the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defiled the armies of the living God." And David said, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you."
All right. So, what is David really saying to Saul? This is where David just has the biggest.
The Lord fights his battles.
There's something a little deeper. Why did he explain what all he did? Because there's this certain, remember, God's trying to lead with voice. And what's the example of voice? Who leads with voice? Shepherds, right? So the shepherd's leading with voice. So this isn't lost. He's purposely kind of underhandedly saying. He's basically saying, I've been taking care of my father's sheep. One sheep was taken and went after. I went and killed a lion and I killed a bear. So who's this someone we've mentioned that said, if one of the sheep goes astray, I would leave the 99 and go find one? Someone said that in the Bible. Jesus, right? Here's Jesus. Okay. So they don't know yet, but when Jesus is saying this, this is what he's, bringing back to the story. And he defeated whatever challenge was there. He would fight it and save the one. And what happens after he saves the one?
There's a party.
There's a party. There's great rejoicing. The angels sing, right? So this is, when Jesus says it, this is where it's going back to. And he's saying, how have you shepherded your flock, Saul? For 40 days, God's been testing you. This guy's been testing you. David's there one day, hears it right when he shows up, and he's ready to go down there and fight. So really, him saying this, and this is in front of all his commanders and all his leaders, he's basically calling the king out, saying, you're the king. You're a foot taller than everyone else. There's no one like you. You're supposed to be this leader, this warrior. You should be right down there the first day and go fight him. But you're coward here for 40 days. So I'm going to go fight it. So let's read 38 to 40. Someone read 38 to 40.
Then Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armor on him, a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened on his sword over the tunic and tried walking around because he was not used to them. I cannot go in these, he said to Saul, because I am not used to them. So he took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with his sling in his hand approached the Philistine.
All right. So, what do we see in this verse? What can we draw from this? It goes with this empire versus shalom. All right. So, one thing about David, he fully trusted God. Even when we attempt to try to go do something, we get scared. And what did Saul gave him? The best armor and everything. Say, here, take this. And David's like, I can't work in this. I have to just go and trust God. And that's the big thing. And you'll see staff. So important when you hear staff. What did Moses lead with? Staff. What did Egypt have? armies and whips, but with a staff, Moses did all this stuff. So when you see that staff, when he goes out with a sling and staff, that's basically, if you're a Hebrew, you're calling, oh, Moses. God leads with a staff. And a shepherd's crook is not for striking sheep. It's for helping, hooking them. It's for guiding them. There's no violence. They lead with their voice. So this is important. He puts on the armor and says, I can't do this. I trust God. I'm going to do what God wants me to do. And I'm going to go down, choose 5 stones, and I have my shepherd's staff. So here's a bonus question for next week. Why did he pick 5 stones? There may be a prize next week if you can figure out and bring the answer. Why 5 stones?
Is it metaphorical, or was he worried?
You have to find out. There you go. That's your homework assignment.
Do we
So-
get an everything bagel?
Might be. Who knows? Maybe a coupon for lots of bagels. We don't know. But for everyone out there, bring the answer. Why 5 stones? You're going to have to kind of dig. We kind of already went over it, but I'll let y'all try to figure that out. So he chose 5 smooth stones. And you saw that stream right there when he was going down. That was where he went. And so this would have been the scene, right? Here's David. Here's Goliath. You know, he's coming up to his hip. And he's just going, staring down. Or you're about to hear David's speech, which I love. So someone read 1 Samuel 17, 41 to 47.
And the Philistine moved forward and came near to David with his shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field. Then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistine this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with a sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand.
All right. So what is David emphasizing in this speech?
Just that his strength is God.
God, right? That's the one thing that separates David from all the other kings, right? David, it's all about God's going to deliver me. God's going to deliver me. And there's a very similarity if you read Jesus, right? What is Jesus always saying?
My brother.
God gives me strength. God is, why you call me good? Only my Father's good, right? He's always referring to God as the source of this power. And here, there's no selflessness. There's no empire. He's saying, hey, God's going to deliver me from this. And it's pretty ballsy. I mean, think about it. You're going up to a guy this big, and then you're that much faith, that much courage. It's just incredible. So he comes to you in the name of the Lord. I'm going to do this so all the earth may know there is a God in Israel. It's intent, right? I think that's one problem we have today is our intentions are good, but do we do it for selfish reasons? To better ourselves, to get a name on a building, or do we do it because we're doing it for God? It's kind of a dangerous line. And that all the assembly may know. Remember, what if we set up this battle here? You have Israel behind, and you have Goliath and the Philistine army, right? He's proven this point to all of Israel. And another thing, God does not save with sword and spear. So he's emphasizing again, it's the empire shalom. I don't need a sword and a spear. God's going to save me no matter what. He's going to lead with voice. All right, so getting to the conclusion now. So 1 Samuel 17, 48 to 54.
And the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David. David ran quickly toward the battle line of the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on his forehead. the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. And the men of Israel and Judah rose with a shout and pursued the Philistines as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron, so that the wounded Philistines fell on the way from Shaaraim as far as Gath and Ekron. And the people of Israel came back from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their camp. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent.
All right, so what happened here? What do we see in these verses? Victory. But what else do we see? It should kind of... Who do we say Goliath was?
Giant.
The devil, right? He's setting it up. So what happened in this? What did that sling do?
Crushed his head.
Crushed his head. Is there a significant somewhere back kind of that symbolizes this right here? I don't know. I mean, that's the way. Genesis 3, right?
Yes.
Pull it right.
David prevailed with sling and stone, not sword and spear, not this 15-pound javelin, this armor, 125-pound armor, this helmet, this big shield. No, just a little sling and stone. Why a sling and a stone? So you got to know your little Old Testament. This is a really cool nugget of truth. Why do we think sling and stone?
Was that a regular thing? Has that ever been used before?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
There you go. Yeah, you're on the right track. So it's been used before. Let's read Judges 20, 12 to 16. So.
And the tribes of Israel sent men through all the tribe of Benjamin, saying, What evil is this that has taken place among you? Now therefore, give up the men, the worthless fellows in Gibeah, that we may put them to death and purge evil from Israel. But the Benjaminites would not listen to the voice of their brothers, the people of Israel. Then the people of Benjamin came together out of the cities to Gibeah to go out to the battle against the people of Israel. And the people of Benjamin mustered out of their cities on that day 26,000 men who drew the sword, besides the inhabitants of Gibeah, who mustered 700 chosen men. Among all these were 700 chosen men who were left-handed. Everyone could sling a stone at a hair and not miss.
Okay, so is this an insult to someone? Like further just jabbing in this subtle insult?
Yeah.
Who were the sling throwers? Benjaminites. And when you see you're set apart, that was like the Navy SEALs of that time. So Benjamin has this, the tribe of Benjamin has this tradition of these sling throwers that are just awesome, special forces. And Saul's a what? Benjaminite. Here's Judah coming up here, a shepherd boy with a sling, kills Goliath with it. So again, remember, if you're a Hebrew, you're going to read this every year. You go through the Torah. So when they're hearing this story, that's what they're going back to, is like, oh dang, Saul could have done it with a sling and spear. It's more of these, because right before this happened, God was done with Saul. He starts going into madness, and he starts seeing he's done with him. He lost his favor. So, I would say, he struck the Philistine in the head, fell face down. What is Genesis 3:15? He will crush your head, and you will be a belly, and you will eat dust. So he didn't just fall on his back, he didn't fall on his side. He purposely fell face first, eating dirt. So this, not taking away that, this is Jesus coming further, but they didn't have that then. So if you're Hebrew and you're reading it and you're seeing David, oh man, this is a big deal right here. So he didn't have a sword, right? But David said, I'm going to kill you. So he cut off his head. It's very insulting to take someone's weapon and then cut off your own head with it. That's like a very insult. You know, you already struck this dude down, and then you took his head. So, again, this is David taunting the Philistines, cutting off a head, holding up the head, and watching this whole Philistine army that for 40 days has been, yeah, no one's going to touch us, and just run. And then you have, imagine Israel just coming down the mountain, chasing them all the way back to the coastal plain. So, in conclusion, you got to throw that stone, right? A stone in a sling is worthless. You know, a lot of times we have a stone in a sling, we talk about it, we want to do this, we think, but you got to get your feet wet, right? That's what I love about this is David had to cross through a stream, so got his feet wet, picked up the stones, and then went on to his journey. So not only do we have to get our feet wet, God needs someone who's willing to go out there. He's going to give you the tools, which is your sling and stone, but if you don't use those tools, you know, he can destroy evil. With the stone in the air, God can destroy evil. So we got to be about it. It's just more building this faith. And we must have the right intentions. And that's one thing about David. David fought not for glory, but to defend God's name. So David's doing everything for God. And no matter how small you feel, God does great things with small people. God does not want the best speakers, the bravest person. He doesn't need that. God just needs you to get those feet wet. He just needs someone. If you just do it, God will guide you. So you got to pick up a stone. So get your feet wet, pick up that stone, throw it. And you just trust the story. This is all it comes back to, trust me. David demonstrated, here is Satan, the big evil of the day, the best empire, kind of like Egypt. And this little shepherd boy, 12, 13, half the size of Goliath, went down there, took out Philistine, they raided him, and they won a victory. All from this little boy. So it doesn't matter. And this is the whole point of it. It's not just random. God doesn't do stuff randomly. Everything has a point, and so this is God, right? And then after this, David starts to become a thing, and you see Saul killed his thousands, David his 10,000s, right? And it just keeps building and building this greatness of David. And that's it. And then that's one thing too about David. There's a note that when he fought, he didn't fight to expand his empire. He really fought and controlled the promised land just like God said. And of course, his sons, destroyed it after that. But when he fought, he never went anywhere further than Israel. He conquered brought it all together and did what God promised ultimately. So a man after God's own heart. And we're all that. So, any questions, comments before we close? So I hope taking away from this when we read the Old Testament, you saw there was a lot of going back and power and numbers, so slow it down. Try to get commentary, try to get chronicles, try to get it and just kind of really dig. There's a lot of deeper meaning into all these stories, and they all have points, and they all go back to Genesis. You're all going to find it's all going to go back to trust the story. Genesis 1. So will y'all pray with me? Father God, thank you for this day, this time together, that help us all to go out there into this world and get our feet wet, pick up a stone, and throw it. And just trust that you will deliver us and do us what we're supposed to do, to glorify you and to help this body of Christ. And the world needs us. It needs light. It's dark. Help us to be that. Help us to trust the story and to just give us courage, Lord. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.